So Bob, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you make some opening comments, and then we're going to jump in with some questions.
Thank you, Kathy. It's great to be here. A little over 21 years ago, my first son was born, and my wife allowed me to name him. So I gave him a first name, of course, and he took my last name of Wright, and I gave him two middle names. And so his full name is Alexander Hamilton was Wright. And for the past 2 decades, I have to field questions like, so what was Alexander Hamilton Wright about? Well, that's not the meaning of my last name. My last name is spelled with a W, W-R-I-G-H-T. It is not Wright, it is a Wright. It is a creator of things, as in wheelwright or cartwright. So the better question is, what did Alexander Hamilton create? And the answer is the United States of America. Now, that might sound like hyperbole, but it's really not, because he was the only person who was involved in all 4 of the major institutions that made the United States and every other developed country in the world, by the way, the fount of material prosperity that we've become. And those 4 institutions are a government that protects human rights, like life, liberty, and property, a modern financial system, which is going to be the crux of the discussion today, but basically a stable money supply, markets for exchanging securities and risk, and effective financial intermediaries like banks. The third institution is open access entrepreneurship, which basically means the ability of commercial and social entrepreneurs to easily and cheaply enter and exit various marketplaces. And the fourth is modern management, the ability to manage and administer large, complex organizations like corporations, be they for-profit or nonprofit, or administrative units of government, bureaucracies. So Hamilton was the only one of the founders involved in all 4 of stages, or all 4 of those institutions. The government, of course, by helping out so much in the revolution, but then, making sure that there was a constitutional convention called, taking part in that convention. The financial system during his time as Washington's Treasury Secretary, open access entrepreneurship, because of some things that he did that are little known or little understood regarding the ease of forming corporations. And modern management. What very few people know about Hamilton is that he was one of the most efficient administrators of all time. He knew how to get things done using as little time and resources as possible, and developed some techniques as a Treasury Secretary that are still taught today, basically in terms of management. So in terms of the financial system and his time as Treasury Secretary, he did four very important and interrelated things. One was to fund the national debt. That was the money that the United States owed to various people that it had borrowed or taken during the American Revolution. He assumed he had the federal government assume the debts of the state governments incurred during the Revolutionary War. He defined the US dollar in terms of gold and silver, and then he established the Bank of the United States, sometimes called the First Bank of the United States or the National Bank or what have you. And that helped with the other three pillars of this modern financial system. The first bank was constitutional in my estimation and in his estimation, obviously, and he was able to convince many, but not all, of his fellow Americans that it was constitutional. Though no place in the Constitution does it say that the federal government can establish a national bank or can charter a corporation. But his argument was that the bank was formed in order to meet goals that are enumerated, that are explicitly discussed in the Constitution, particularly paying off the national debt and regulating the money supply, and that the bank is just a means, the most efficient means for achieving those ends, and is hence constitutional. That does not mean that he would think that Social Security is constitutional, or that vaccine mandates are constitutional, or the Green New Deal is constitutional. His argument was very specific about that bank and at that time and what the US government needed.
Okay, well, that is a great opening and just fascinating. And did you get, I guess you got through all four of your points about what he did as Treasury Secretary. But we can jump in and start asking some questions if that's okay with you. First of all, I did not know that Alexander Hamilton contributed to modern management, and I'm fascinated by that. Would you have any examples of some of the techniques that you were talking about that he instituted at the Treasury Secretary that people are still practicing today?
Sure, and this isn't my stuff, by the way. There's a fellow almost 30 years ago now named Harvey. I pronounce it Flaumenhoft. I have no idea how it's pronounced, but the name of the book is The Effective Republic, and he describes in great detail what Alexander Hamilton did administratively. And one of the notions that is near and dear to my heart as a writer is to take the time to write short correspondence. You know, sometimes Benjamin Franklin, sometimes Voltaire, various people, get attributed with the quotation, "I'm sorry I wrote such a long letter, but I didn't have time to write a short one." Right. So this is one of the many things in American pedagogy that drove me nuts when I was a college professor. And that is giving students minimum page or word length. And so I, in turn, would drive students crazy by saying the paper should be as long as it needs to be and no longer.
Okay, this is Janine. Hi.
Hey.
Hi. Stepping in here. How you doing?
Good.
Okay.
So I was just explaining how Alexander Hamilton helped to create efficient administration in the Treasury Department. And one of
that is so cool. That's so cool.
Yeah.
The question I would like to ask you, I just want to keep on topic, since it's about Hamilton's bank, so to speak, or the first bank. I'd like to stay on that for a little while. And my first question is, where he believed in the Constitution it was allowed, because you pointed out how it wasn't, but he believed in it. But what did he think? Where did he think in the Constitution it gave him the right to do it, since that was such a sticking point. We've heard why people thought he shouldn't, but not why he thought he should. And then my second question is, what was the bank? I mean, what was the bank supposed to do financially? Who funded the bank? What was the bank's purpose? And then why did so many people not want that bank? And then my third question would be, and I'm going to go back on mute. It's Janine Turner, by the way. My third
Yes.
question would, my
Somebody
third, no,
writing
hang on,
these
one
down?
second, one second. Yeah, my third question would be, how is the bank comparable to today? Is it comparable to the Federal Reserve? So my first question is constitutional. My second question is, what was the bank supposed to really do? And why did people not want that to happen? And my third question is, how does it compare to the Federal Reserve today? Okay,
Yeah.
I'm going back on mute. Thanks.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll take it in reverse order. It's actually closest to the Swiss National Bank today, which is owned primarily by private investors. And that's who primarily owned the banks of the United States, were private investors. The government also had a stake. And part of the reason why people didn't like the first bank was because the way that stake was created. But what Hamilton did was he immediately lent the money that the government used to buy stock in the first bank, and he immediately lent it back to the government. And a lot of people thought that this was, some sort of accounting chicanery or some sort of trick or what have you. And Hamilton was adamant it was not a trick. It was just pretty brilliant, as long as the bank's dividends, which are profits that are paid to stockholders, exceeded the interest that that the government was paying for the loan. It was a net benefit to the government of the United States. And in fact, that came to pass, and the dividends exceeded the contractual interest rate on the loans. And so the government, i.e. the public, made out on that. It also gave the US government an asset that it could sell in times of trouble. And the government later on did decide to sell its stake in the first bank, and used the proceeds to pay off the balance of the loan, but then had a big pot of cash that it could use to fund national defense. Specifically, why it was constitutional, Hamilton points out that the Constitution says that we have to fund the national debt. These monies that we owed to people who we borrowed from, or who we took livestock and food and lead and other raw materials from during the Revolution. Constitution says we need to pay that back, and the bank helped in paying that back. The Constitution also says that the federal government can regulate the money supply. And the bank is a mechanism for regulating, the amount of money in the United States. So it's then a question of what's the most effective means for doing so. And this gets back to Kathy's, question about Hamilton being about efficiency, right? So you do things as cheaply and quickly as possible. That is what is in the best interest of the government and the people of the United States. And so long as Hamilton argued, so long as the goal is constitutional, the means are also constitutional. So
I'm going to step in and ask you a question there. So the bank was funded by the government, but also
private investors.
Private investors. And,
Right.
but also the government, right? So the government and private
Well,
investors.
except as I explained, the government didn't have any cash really to put into it. So
But you said they sold their position to pay off things. So I figured they had some money in it.
later on, after the bank had been paying dividends for years, the government is being credited essentially with the spread between the dividends and the interest rates. So the dividends.
So the government. I'm sorry, I have to interrupt just so our young viewers and I can comprehend this. So
Sure.
the government. So Hamilton actually was able, because of the private citizens invested in the bank, the government actually made some money. They didn't have any money in the beginning, but because the bank was profitable, the government made money from the bank, and then they sold
Right.
that. Do I have that? Is that right? Okay.
That's correct.
So that's really interesting. So it was private citizens primarily coming into this bank who paid off the debt. The war debt was really done by private citizens, not the states.
Well, no, I mean, the debt is being funded or serviced, repaid by taxes, right? The first bank is just part of this panoply of 4 policies of funding the debt, assuming the state debt, formation of the first bank, and the defining of the U.S. dollar in terms of gold and silver. So it's just one aspect of these 4 interrelated policies.
I don't think I understand what you just said, but I mean,
Okay.
private citizens put their money in, and those private citizens thus did, yes or no, help pay the war debt.
Not pay the war debt, help to service the war debt by funding the creation of the first bank.
I'm talking about the private citizens that, no, but hang on. I'm talking about the private citizens that invested their money in the first bank.
Right.
The bank we're talking about.
Right. They did not pay off national debt. They created an institution that helped Hamilton to.
Well, but indirectly, if they hadn't deposited any money, there wouldn't be a bank. So indirectly, maybe not specifically and linearly, but indirectly, if those people hadn't
indirectly, they are helping, right? And that
because otherwise he wouldn't have had any money at all. So it's the private citizens that set up the shares or the stakes or whatever. It was their money that then indirectly helped pay off the debt.
Correct.
Okay.
Right. So
that's interesting.
Yeah. So Hamilton had read Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations, and he was critical of parts of it, but overall, he is a Smithian. He is a free market economist, and he does understand the importance of aligning incentives correctly. So instead of forcing people to do something, Hamilton is always looking for ways to entice them to do it. To create what today we would call win-win scenarios, right? So
the bank was actually funded by the people indirectly through shares. The government really didn't put a lot of their money in it. Is what I'm gathering.
Yeah, and the government doesn't really have much money. The government at the time had assets in the form of these vast Western lands, but nobody really wanted to buy them yet. So the government's very illiquid, we would say today. It's got a lot of wealth in the form of land, but it doesn't have a lot of cash. It doesn't have a lot of gold.
That's real. Okay, so now today, the Federal Reserve is taxpayers' money. It's not private people's money. That's the difference then, right?
I don't know what you mean by that. The Federal Reserve is owned by member banks. Its capital was put up by banks that are members of the Federal Reserve System, which are all the big ones and many smaller ones.
So the Federal Reserve is not a government entity. Just give me a simple sentence. But what I'm asking is
there is no simple.
Well, there is somewhat. We have a Federal Reserve show coming up, but I'm just asking a really kind of question. the Federal Reserve comes from a conglomeration of banks, but banks are filled with private citizens' money.
Correct.
So the Federal Reserve, in essence, has the Americans' money, and in that regard, it is similar to the first Hamilton's Bank.
It's we're no longer on a gold standard. We went off the gold standard in 1973. So there.
No, but I'm just talking about where the money comes from.
Yeah. It's a very, very complex.
Okay, well, let me try
also,
to make
the
it simple.
ownership stakes
The Federal Reserve is not funded by the taxpayers' money.
No.
So it's funded by banks.
The Federal Reserve pays money to the Treasury.
From American people's money, then, coming from a conglomeration of banks.
Well, it's very complex. The stakes that people owned, that private individuals owned in the first bank in the United States was a true equity stake. The shares that the member banks put into the Federal Reserve is not a true equity stake, and that they cannot trade them. There's no market for Federal Reserve shares. It's called restricted stock, and the amount of their dividends are also restricted.
Well, what I'm focusing on is the word they, and they would be the American people who have their money in banks that are part of the Federal Reserve.
Right, and the
Okay,
minimum
so that's
amount
it. That's all I wanted to know. Okay, that's
Yeah.
really interesting. Okay, I probably should shut up because I've taken over too much time. But I just really wanted to understand, it's really interesting to me that the bank primarily was the private citizens bank, not Hamilton's Bank. I always thought, since it was called the National Bank, that it was the government's money. And then it's also interesting to me that the Federal Reserve is not the government's money. That's a conglomeration of banks, which indirectly is the people's money as well. Fascinating. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Kathy. Thank you, guys.
Okay.
Well, and thank you, Janine. That helped clarify quite a bit. I think it might be helpful, and we're going to go to Jewel and Joran in just a minute, but we kind of want to set the stage on why Alexander Hamilton thought the national bank was necessary. And it seems what I'm hearing is that our country had no money. And so he was trying to find a way to generate funds. Is that part of it?
The bank did make loans to the federal government. They were short-term loans because the government, as part of this other part of Hamilton's financial system, is paying interest on the money that it borrowed or confiscated during the American Revolution. Mm-hmm. And it does that 4 times a year. Mm-hmm. The federal government's revenue, the bulk of it, comes from tariff, international trade taxes. Mm-hmm. And that comes in at different times than the end of each fiscal quarter. So the bank would lend the government in anticipation of the taxes being paid eventually, right? Within the next few weeks or the next few months. So it helped just to smooth things out. So the government was paying interest as promised right on time, because the bank is there making sure that happens.
And did President Washington?
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it definitely does. Yeah. And did President Washington agree with Alexander Hamilton that the bank was necessary?
Well, I think at the very least we can say he agreed with Hamilton's notion that Jefferson and Randolph and those and the guys who were saying it unconstitutional had not proven their point.
Okay.
Because Washington believed that if you have a law that passes Congress and it passed quite handily, that it was not the president's role to say no to the people, unless it was very clear that law was unconstitutional.
Okay.
So Hamilton, uncharacteristically, because he didn't have time to write a shorter response, writes this long rebuttal to Jefferson's position, basically pulls an all-nighter, like a college student writing a term paper, and hands this thing over to Washington. And it's not his best piece of writing because he had to do it too quickly. He didn't have the time to edit it down to its essence. But it was enough for Washington to say, yeah, I don't think that Jefferson and Randolph had made the point that this is unconstitutional. He was, of course, presiding over the Constitutional Convention. He knew about what was discussed. He knew that there was, consensus that the national debt had to be repaid. He knew that there was consensus that the federal government would be in charge of monetary policy. And he also knew that it was given at the time, as it is today, that governments have the power to create corporations, right? To charter corporations. Washington himself had chartered several corporations in Virginia, but the state constitutions didn't say that the state governments had the power to charter corporations. It's just a power of government, right? How can you list every single thing that a government can or cannot do? And so, Washington was kind of like, yeah, state governments can do it. It doesn't say that the national government can't do it, right? If we really didn't want the national government to have that power, then it should have been explicitly stated that it doesn't have that power.
Okay. And was that the main argument against the national bank, that those who were against it thought that it wasn't constitutional, or were there other arguments as well?
Oh, there were, some arguments that were, political in nature. There's all kinds of shenanigans that are going on in the background with people positioning themselves about, where the permanent national capital is going to be located. Is it going to be in New York or Philadelphia or someplace on the Potomac or what have you? So people came up with all kinds of reasons, but none of them really hold any water whatsoever. One claim was that it was a monopoly. It is not a monopoly. There were already state chartered banks in existence, one of which Hamilton created, and he would create another one later on. There's nothing in the law that says that states can't charter their own banks. The bank notes issued by the Bank of the United States were not made a legal tender. Nobody had to accept them at any price if they didn't want to. So there's not really much to these other arguments, which are analogous to a lot of things that go on today, where people bring up specious side angles just to try to deflect attention from the core issue, which was really the constitutional issue.
Okay.
So I have a quick question. It's Janine again, and then we probably need to turn over to Jill and Jordan. Did if there had been an income tax, Hamilton wouldn't have needed to have done this. But since there was no income tax, which of course is put upon all Americans, whether they want to give to the country or not, Hamilton's way of doing it was people who had the inclination and wanted to give money to the government and put it in the bank and buy the shares in the First National Bank could do so. I'm just really thinking that that's an interesting concept.
No, I mean, we're not connecting someplace on the way the fisc works. I mean, for starters, the income tax was unconstitutional under the Constitutionally originally, right? We had to pass an amendment later on in order to make.
I know that. I'm very familiar that we had to pass an income tax.
It wasn't even part of the part.
No,
part,
I know that.
I
know that we had to pass an amendment. I'm very aware of that. Well, the correlation that I'm making is that, according to what you've been saying, Hamilton's bank was funded by private citizens. We don't have to get hung up on the word funded. But
They
private
bought
citizens,
shares in the bank.
right.
They
But
owned
yeah,
equity.
but if the private citizens hadn't bought shares in the bank, there would be no bank. So the private citizens were primarily responsible for the bank. So they were giving their money voluntarily. Obviously, they
Not,
probably thought
not giving, investing.
okay, whatever. Just please don't get hung up on the words. Okay. The bottom line is the people gave their money to this bank, however word you want to put it. So the next thing that I'm saying is that if there had been an income tax, I'm not making philosophical judgments about whether it was right or wrong, they already would have had money. So it's interesting to me that an income tax, which was passed, which you can debate that all day long, whether it was right or wrong, demands people give money. But in this circumstance, it was the people who had money that voluntarily decided they would invest in the bank.
Right.
And I'm just thinking, if there hadn't been, and if there had been an income tax back then on your salary that was later done with the amendment, 16th Amendment, how would this structure have been different?
I don't think it would have been different at all. We still would have needed the Bank of the United States for a variety of reasons. One reason is that
No, I'm not saying we wouldn't need the bank. I'm saying the income tax money would have gone into this bank then. Yes or no?
well, just like the money from the tariff, which was the main source of government revenue, these taxes on international trade were going into the bank. And that's what's ultimately paying or servicing the national debt. It's not the shareholders' equity in the bank that's making those payments. It's the tax revenue.
So I guess if there had been a income tax, it would have operated kind of the same way as tariffs. Tariffs were the income tax.
Right. Exactly. Yes.
So,
thank you.
Yes, that's
that's
the correlation I'm trying to make.
Okay.
Right? That's the correlation I'm trying to make. Yes.
Yeah, we had, and the reason, I mean, besides the unconstitutionality of there were other types of taxes that were possible, like excise taxes that were constitutional, but they were much more difficult to collect. So again, as part of the efficiency that Hamilton's seeking, the tariffs are the most efficient, because there are relatively few large import merchants, and they're the ones who pay the tax. Right, so it's not everyone in the country that you have to track. You know, back when people are using quill pens and people are living in the woods and so on and so forth. It's you know, a couple of hundred large import merchants, all in the major seaport cities, and that's all you have to track you know, the business activities of. And then you collect the tax from them, and then they turn around and build the tax into the price of the goods when they retail it.
Okay.
So it's
Well, great.
very efficient.
Shall we turn it over to Jewel and Jorn?
Hello, how are you doing today?
All right, how are you?
Good. Very hard to wrap my head around.
It is. This is why I primarily write
starting
books.
this. You know, being Hamilton in this situation and having so much forethought in starting a national bank is just really amazing.
Well,
so
he's basing it off from precedents in Holland and in Great Britain.
Yeah.
So we want to be careful not to give him too much credit. It's more one of adopting rather than creating.
Yeah, I got you. So right now we're dangerously close to this rampant debt, this rampant incurrence of debt in our country. And where in their time it was because of the Revolutionary War, you don't have a choice in that. Now it kind of seems like it's just growing by choice almost. But we also now have the added danger of printing money, which they did not have back then.
Yes.
So I just want to know, like, how could you fix this? How could you fix this mindset? Because it's more of a mindset than anything else, it seems, that our debts are now not from state to state where we all have our common good in mind, but now to other countries which are far more hostile and looking to get ahead.
Well, a lot of the early US debt was owned by foreigners as well. Dutch investors, the French government, later on British investors. So things aren't really all that different with China now. But you're absolutely right that the Bank of the United States could not just print money willy-nilly. We were on the gold standard and bimetallic standard, gold and silver, that Hamilton established. So, and nobody again had to accept the notes of the Bank of the United States. So if it had issued a whole bunch of them and people are like, whoa, where is all this coming from? They wouldn't have to take them. And they wouldn't have to take them at face value. They could say, yeah, that says $10 on it, but we know that this bank is, is not gonna last. So, maybe I'll give you, 20 cents on the dollar for it and whatnot. So there was a market mechanism that kept the Bank of the United States in line that we do not have with the Federal Reserve. And Hamilton warned about this predilection in democracies of politicians starting new programs with borrowed money, because that's the easiest thing to do. Because then you go back to your constituents and you say, you pound your chest, I gave you this and I gave you that, without mentioning the fact that at the same time, they're taking away from those people later in life, or from their children and grandchildren and so forth. So he was very aware of that. And in fact, there's a famous quotation that a lot of people allied or cut the middle out of. But what Hamilton said was, a national debt, if it is not excessive, will be a blessing. And a lot of times people cut that middle part out, but that middle part is really the most important part, if it is not excessive. And he had some very strong guidelines about what it meant to be excessive. And he also argued that every time that the government borrowed money, it should create a tax to fund or service, repay that debt. And we stopped doing that. There's a wonderful book on this by former Democratic governor of Texas named Bill White. It's called America's Fiscal Constitution. And he explains how these rules that Hamilton set up lasted for a couple hundred years almost, but then started to erode after we went off the gold standard in 1973, and today are like completely forgotten.
Well,
it's like,
I wanna jump to my next question before we run out of time. So it was very important to get off of reliance on other countries, especially away from Britain. We didn't want any reliance. And we've delved into reliance, especially in producing in other countries, because it's, cheaper or what have you. Not many things are tagged made in America. And that seems so opposite to what Hamilton was creating in all four of the facets that you had mentioned earlier, and the bank as well. And I would like to know, suppose he was here today and he was given the power to, what would be the one thing he would, like one law he would pass, one thing he would do that would set us back on track to getting closer to being more reliant purely on US soil?
Oh, I don't think he believed in that. International trade was very important.
Trade, but not building over somewhere else. That's very different.
Well,
Yeah, no, I think what he means is
build
not
in the United States, right?
No, that's not exactly. It means the debt. So in economics, there's different ways of consisting of a trade deficit. A trade deficit can be our modern economic theory doesn't really compare to the way they thought of a trade deficit. Hamilton viewed trade with other countries as a way still to enrich your own, no matter how he was viewing it. He was a free market with central control, and it was always about that. It was about production. So if there was a point when the country was made weaker through the trade in the system of trade, then if the country was made weaker by that trade, Hamilton wouldn't be for it because he was a pragmatist. So if he saw any product being produced overseas in a way where we lost power to support ourselves, or where we lost wealth that then America could have its own, he wouldn't have been for it because he was a pragmatist above all else as far as in monetary theory. Right now, so I guess he was very for foreign trade. He was not an isolationist, unlike other founding fathers, but he certainly wasn't for letting other people be better businessmen than the United States of America, because he viewed our country almost as a corporation.
I don't think so. No. But I know where that's coming from. And I think the people who have been espousing that are incorrect. And I've been fighting basically my whole career to try to dissuade people from that very point of view. And obviously we don't have time here to work through all of the issues involved. But the key was that people in the 19th century used Hamilton's report on manufacturers to try to push their own protectionist agenda. They wanted high tariffs that would protect certain industries in the US. And then one fellow took these ideas and took them to Germany. And they really distort what Hamilton was after. And it's because the report on manufacturers is a pedagogical device. It was almost a textbook. He's trying to explain to all these legislators in Congress what the effects of different policies would be. And then people later on come in and they say, oh, he's talking about a high tariff here. He must have wanted a high tariff. Well, he didn't want a high tariff. He wanted a revenue tariff so that he could pay the interest and the principal on the national debt. So yeah, there's a lot of confusion in that era and that whole area. He was for corporations, but he did not consider the United States as one entity. In fact, he's constantly talking about—
No, not at all. But when you compare him to Jefferson, he certainly, I mean, there's almost if you're comparing him to the Jeffersonian idea, he certainly believed America was one compared to Jefferson's America was 13. 13 units.
He's a nationalist. He's absolutely a nationalist.
He's a strong nationalist who, if it wasn't for his nationalist voice, there would be no nation. So, we have to, there certainly must be an amount of relativity, because you can't compare Hamilton to today. He would, the sense of the centralization of power today is on an entirely different spectrum than what Hamilton even saw for anything in our nation. Because while I said he was a pragmatist before, all of our founders wrote on principle, and it was the things going on. The show's not about this, but for as much as Hamilton was for central government, the centralized ideas of today's government are not what Hamilton was for whatsoever. When we look at Hamilton's bank, and we look at the getting our country able to stand economically, which is it was a idea at the time which was fresh and new and different when you're comparing it to all of recorded history. We did not have this concept of market trading. We went over the mercantile system last week, and then coming to this week as we go over the bank. Can you explain the tie as fast as you can? Can you show how this, besides the national debt, how was our economic system, leaving the mercantile system, how is our economic system reliant on this bank, or what did this bank do for it? How did it unlock our potential?
Well, it's part of this, again, this system that Hamilton created, this four and four, it's helping with the funding of the national debt, the repaying of the money that we owed from the revolution, the assumption of the state debts, which relieved the states from having to have high taxes and from having to compete with each other for taxes. And this defining of the dollar in terms of specific amounts of gold and silver. And really the whole thing rests on that, because what's the sense of having a dollar denominated debt if you can play with what the value of the dollar is, right? That's what we're going on. That's what's going on right now with inflation. So you're not going to see big swings in the price level under a gold and silver standard that Hamilton established, and that the Bank of the United States is essentially regulating. Right. We talked about how it didn't have an incentive to issue too many notes. It also had incentives when the state banks are issuing notes of when they're paid at their counters, at the counters of the Bank of the United States, which had several branches across the country. It would then take those notes and return them to the state banks for gold and silver. And so that kept them from issuing too many notes as well. So it's a form of regulation that is not top down with almighty, all-knowing, supposedly administrators. It is a type of market regulation of the money supply, and so it's
that allowed for business between individuals, and including that if there was investment or interest to be collected, then that investment was seen as a protected investment to an extent, because the return on it would be coming from at least a market, and it would be tied to a metal standard of some way, and they could trust that tomorrow their money wasn't going to be worth nothing, hopefully.
Absolutely right. And then that ties into that second base that I talked about, the open access entrepreneurship. There's a proliferation of just an explosion in the number of businesses and in the size of businesses because of these four things that Hamilton put into place. I've written a book called The Corporation Nation, where I explain how I counted all of these corporations that were formed before the Civil War. It was much more than in any other country in the world at that time, even though we did not have the world's largest economy until much, much later. And we also didn't have as many people as places like Great Britain until midway through the 19th century. So it was just a burgeoning of that private market economy on this strong foundation of the financial system, which rested on the strong foundation of the Constitution.
All right. And then last question, where is it constitutional for the federal government to charter a business? Where was that drawn out of in the text?
It doesn't say it. But it also doesn't say it in any of the state constitutions, and all the state governments were chartering corporations.
It seems tough because the state government, because it says in the Constitution that other power is not granted as federal or granted to states, which gives them a wider charter of activities. But the federal government is meant to be tied to the text of the Constitution. So things that are not mentioned don't then just become the federal government's power.
Well, the state constitution, the state governments are supposed to be tied to the text of the state constitution.
Of their individual ones, I mean, of the federal Constitution, the powers in the federal Constitution do then not negate any power to the state. Whereas the Constitution the state doesn't have, the federal government does not have any power that is not listed or at all in the Constitution. That open to the states to write in their constitutions their powers, but our Constitution was meant to not just give them any power that's not listed.
But remember, the 10th Amendment does not say explicitly, and it doesn't say explicitly for a reason, because Madison left it out. He left it out on purpose. There are powers, and there's a wonderful article by a Temple law professor named Robert Reinstein that goes into detail on this, but there are lots of things that the federal government does that nobody complains about that are not explicitly in the federal Constitution.
Well, we
Remember, it also
complain about it
doesn't.
here sometimes.
What's that?
I said we complain about those things here sometimes.
Well, no, these are things like, issuing visas and passports, right? That's not stated in the Constitution anyplace. And
Yeah, we
yet
had a show on that.
definitely a function of the federal government. So, and this Reinstein article, by the way, points out that Hamilton believed that the government had broad discretion, but only within its purview. And its purview is laid out in the preamble and in the sections of the main body of the Constitution itself. And basically, it is limited to fighting wars and interstate and international commerce. And then, these ancillary things of paying off the national debt and of regulating the money supply, which it ties into the ability to fight wars. While the federal government might not have the power to create, manufacturing corporations, because that would lie outside that scope, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have the power to charter a bank.
All right. I get in some audience questions. Thank you very much.
Great questions, by the way, guys.
Yeah. Thank you. Great questions, Joel and Jordan. Thank you so much. We have Robert from Washington State is asking, the National Bank seems like it at the time, at least it started out helping the United States, especially at a time when it didn't have a lot of funding, but about 20 years later, it was not renewed. Its charter was not renewed, and Andrew Jackson opposed it. Can you talk just a little bit here in closing about why it was not renewed? And we want to try to get in at least one more audience question. So maybe just in a quick minute here.
Oh, yeah. Well, the clarification is necessary. The first bank is not renewed in 1811. Then a second bank is formed in 1816, and that's the one that Andrew Jackson doesn't renew and goes out of existence in 1836.
Okay.
And it was a very close thing in 1811. It came down to the casting vote of the Vice President of the United States, George Clinton of New York, and then Albert Gallatin, the longtime Treasury Secretary, lamented it because he really could have used a Bank of the United States functioning during the War of 1812. And we suffered greatly because of it. And, probably would not even have needed the Battle of New Orleans if we had had a strong functioning Bank of the United States to help to move funds around, to do things like build up the fleet in the Great Lakes that we simply didn't have at our disposal during the Second War of Independence.
Okay. And then one of our listeners wants to know what Hamilton would think about cryptocurrency today. Do you think he would have an opinion on that?
Wow, that's a great question. He might see Bitcoin and Bitcoin alone as a type of virtual or electronic reserve. It's not very good in hand-to-hand, transactions and retail transactions, but it could serve some of the purposes of gold. A lot of the other, cryptocurrencies are fundamentally different from Bitcoin economically anyway, even if they have identical code, because they don't have that same set of interests in maintaining the veracity of the blockchain that Bitcoin was able to produce, primarily because it really got started and got up and running before anyone knew what cryptocurrency was and was paying attention, was trying to hack the thing. So yeah, he might be in favor of Bitcoin.
Very interesting. Now, a few of our listeners seem to think that the power to start the national bank is included in the necessary and proper clause,
Yeah.
which is kind of interesting. And then finally, Tracy from New Jersey asks, is today's Federal Reserve, how, and we're having our next show is on the Federal Reserve, but how is today's Federal Reserve the same or different than the national bank?
It's much more an organ of the government. This came up earlier with some of Janine's questions. While it's technically owned by the member banks, it is clearly controlled and has been clearly controlled since the Roosevelt administration by the federal government. Now, it does have some degree of independence, but the amount of its independence, meaning independent from government or political control, seems to vary over time and is hotly contested. No one was worried that the U.S. federal government ran the Bank of the United States.
Okay.
It was completely independent, no doubt about it.
Well, we're really looking forward to continuing this conversation next week when we can get in even more to the Federal Reserve. And we just want to thank you for your time and for being with us today. And it was really fascinating to learn more about Alexander Hamilton and all the ways that he impacted our economy, and he's still having an effect today. So thank you so much. And Jewel and Jordan, is there anything you'd like to say in closing?
Yeah, thank you for a great show. We were trying to pack as much as we could into, our a little bit of time, and you answered them everything, and look at the books. And this is a huge topic, so I encourage everyone to check it out. And from a constitutional standpoint, it certainly raises things that pertain greatly to everything that we talk about on the chats.
Yes, please join us next week at 2:00 for the Federal Reserve. So thank you so much. Goodbye, everybody.